Hi and welcome. Remember that is really, really okay to give yourself 15, 20, 30 seconds to just breathe. But usually when you're coming into a class, your brain is getting all sorts of signals that it's time to start. So we're trying to create that now. Hi. Today we get to start the nervous system, which is, y'all are probably going to be like, you say this about every system, but the nervous system is so cool. So cool. And kind of like everything else, it integrates with everything. All of our systems integrate with each other, but the nervous system, much like the endocrine system, really is critically important to everything. So we'll just start with the basics. We're talking about the nervous system. There are two major divisions of the nervous system. So the entire nervous system, and then we can divide that into the peripheral nervous system. Sorry if you're hearing my dog growl. That's very her. And then the central nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is really exactly what it sounds like. It's everything out in the periphery. So if you think about the periphery of your vision, it's out here, right? So the peripheral nervous system is essentially everything that doesn't run down the center of your body. And then your central nervous system is exactly the opposite. It's everything that does run down the center of your body. So that would be your brain and your spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system is pretty much just everything else. So then the next sort of thing, of course, in the central nervous system is the tissue that makes up the central nervous system. And we've talked before about what is this tissue specialized for. In our discussion of tissues, when we went over tissues in general, we talked about what nervous tissue is highly specialized for. So kind of reach back in your memory. What is it specialized for? Okay, specialized for electrical communication. And there are two broad types of cells in the nervous system that are specialized for electrical communication. And these are the neurons and the neuroglia. We'll spend a lot of time dissecting a neuron. And we'll talk about neuroglia kind of briefly. We'll do an overview, but then we'll come back and touch on neuroglia throughout our study of the nervous system. So first, we're going to talk about neuroglia. So right now, let's see, we're talking about the neuroglia. Give that a title. The neuroglia in the PNS. PNS stands for the peripheral nervous system. Okay, there are two types of neuroglial cells in the peripheral nervous system. The neuroglial cells, we think of them kind of as support cells, which makes them sound like they're not as important. And the neuron is kind of the star of the show. But very, very often when there's some sort of neurological problem, more often when there's a neurological problem, the problem is actually with the neuroglial cells and not with the neurons. So while we think of them as support cells, they're critical to neurological function. In the peripheral nervous system, we have satellite cells and Schwann cells. And satellite cells help support the health of the neurons. We won't be talking about them a whole lot, but we will be talking quite a lot about the Schwann cells. What the Schwann cells form is a really important structure called the myelin sheath. Schwann cells form the myelin sheath. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, and if you're like, I don't know what the myelin sheath is, no worries. We're going to talk about that more. Then in the central nervous system, we have quite a few more of the neuroglial cells, of these neuroglial support cells. The first one that we're going to talk about, oh, you can't see it because my head is in the way. Maybe I should just move my head to the other side of the screen. Get me out of the way. Maybe I'll be less in the way there. Okay, so first one we're going to talk about is oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes are the cells that form the myelin sheath in the central nervous system. So notice there's a difference. In the peripheral nervous system, the cells that do this are called the Schwann cells. In the central nervous system, the cells that do this are called oligodendrocytes. I don't know if you can see that, if that's big enough. Oligodendrocytes. So I'll write that out. Oligodendrocytes form the myelin sheath. And if you look, they have these processes extending off of them, kind of like dendrocytes. And so that's kind of how I remember oligodendrocytes. And we'll talk more about those in a moment. Microglia. Okay, so microglial cells are, I mean, they're all cool, right? I say this about everything. Okay, the microglia, these are the central nervous system's immune cells. This is your central nervous system's first line of defense. These are macrophages. And we will talk a lot about macrophages when we get to the immune system, but phagy means eating. And so these are the immune cells in the central nervous system that eat the invaders. Astrocytes are next. Astrocytes do all sorts of important stuff in the brain, but the thing I'm going to focus on is that they're critical to the blood-brain barrier. And we will expand on that more. Then ependymal cells. The ependymal cells, they line the we haven't gone through that yet. They line the sort of fluid-filled cavities of the central nervous system. Man, I'm having problems. It doesn't like my hand. Are you guys able to see that? No. Well, hang on just a second. I'm going to fix that. Okay, sorry about that. Been having fits with getting stuff to work correctly lately. So, anyway, the ependymal cells, what do? They line the fluid-filled cavities of the central nervous system. And when we go through the central nervous system a little bit more, we'll talk about that more, of course. So those are the neuroglial cells. And we will come back to those quite a lot. But kind of the star of the show when we talk about the nervous system is, of course, the neuron, right? This is sort of a basic structure of a neuron. And I'm going to go through each of these components and explain what they are and just a little bit about what they do. Not a lot about what they do, because we're going to talk about that in detail later as we get to each of these structures. So over here on the left side of your screen, kind of standing out in like a pink color, these little things, like kind of almost look like branches. These are called the dendrites. Dendrites, what they do is they receive information. So the dendrites receive information, And then this structure kind of looks like a little globby thing outlined in green this is the cell body. So this structure here, the cell body, and this little thing kind of in the middle, that's the nucleus. And the cell body has all of the parts that we typically associate with a cell. As you can see, of course, the neuron isn't shaped like a typical cell. It's all stretched out and has these specialized things coming off of it. The cell body is the part of the neuron that has the stuff in it that we typically associate with a cell, so like the nucleus and most of the organelles. Then between the green cell body and the orange long extension here, there's this little purple structure, this little purple spot. And that little purple spot is called the axon hillock. Not sure if you can see that. Yeah, that shows up. Okay. The axon hillock. And the axon hillock is so important for an action potential. So it's not just a throwaway thing, oh, this is a spot, okay? Critically important to the formation of an action potential. Then the cell body, axon hillock. The next structure is the axon. So this long thing right here is the axon. And the axon, what it does is it carries information from the cell body to the terminus. And I mean, it's terminus, it's just the end, right? Terminal. Like when you go to an airport, you go to the terminal. If someone's terminally ill, that means their illness is going to terminate their life. That terminus is the end. So the axon carries information from the cell body to the terminus. An axon can be wildly long. So you have neurons in your body that have axons that run the length of your leg. It can be super, super long. So we have the axon. And then down here at the end, as I indicated, find a good color for this. This structure, sometimes there's one, sometimes there's two, sometimes there's 50, is the axon terminus. So the end of the axon. That's the structure of a neuron. And the way that this works is that you have an input signal at the dendrites. They receive information. It's integrated at the cell body, and then you have an output signal that goes out through the axon hillock. And you'll find out why I say the axon, or the output signal goes out the axon hillock, and I don't say, oh, and then it goes through the axon, and then it goes through the axon terminal. It does, but hopefully it'll make more sense to you why we say input signal integration and output signal at the axon hillock when we get deeper into this. So what happens when a neuron receives information is that you have a terminus from another neuron here coming close to the dendrites of the neuron. So it just comes close though. They don't touch. So how is it that information gets from this dendrite, this terminus, which is just coming close to the dendrite of the other neuron? What's happening here to allow that information to get from one neuron to the other? Hopefully you thought neurotransmitters, right? So neurotransmitters get released into this space. This space where neurotransmitters are released is called the synaptic cleft. So the synaptic cleft is actually the space between the two neurons where neurotransmitters get released. How neurotransmitters get released is kind of the big cool thing that we're going to spend this week discussing. What happens is that that information that the dendrites are receiving is an electrical signal. And that electrical signal gets passed from the cell body through the axon hillock, down the axon, to the axon terminus. And what that does is that triggers then the release of these neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. Release of neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft then is the signal that the dendrites pass along through the cell body, axon hillock, and down the axon in their neuron. Okay, couple of more things before we get to that whole process, which is super fun, is that in the peripheral nervous system, I mentioned something called a myelin sheath. And in the peripheral nervous system, what makes up the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system? We just talked about this. What makes up the myelin sheath? The myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system is composed of Schwann cells. So these structures here are actually cells. They're cells wrapped around that axon. And these cells make up what's called the myelin sheath. Okay? The myelin sheath insulates a neuron. And we'll learn a lot more about that as we move into action potentials. So this is the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. These are Schwann cells. And what's actually happening here is that if we rotated this neuron kind of on the side, and so that we could see it as this orange tube here, the Schwann cells have actually wrapped the entire cell around the axon, the whole cell. So this includes the cell's nucleus. This includes all of the components of the cell. So like the nucleus is in there. The whole entire cell is wrapped around the axon of this neuron. So each one of these little bright green things that I've drawn is an individual Schwann cell. Between these individual Schwann cells, you've noticed that it's not continuous. So this insulation, these Schwann cells, they're not right up next to each other. There are spaces. These spaces have a special name. They're called nodes of Ranvier. And I've always thought that that sounds like something out of Lord of the Rings. But these are going to be really, really important when we start talking about the propagation of an action potential, that electrical signal. An action potential is the electrical signal. Okay, so that's in the peripheral nervous system. But in the central nervous system, it's different, as we mentioned before. So that's the PNS, this is the CNS. In the central nervous system, it's not Schwann cells, it's what? What is it in the central nervous system? These are oligodendrocytes. And in the central nervous system, unlike in the peripheral nervous system, the entire cell does not wrap itself around the axon. It extends processes out, and those cellular processes are what wrap themselves around and insulate the axon. And so this is the axon right here of one neuron that's being insulated by the processes of an oligodendrocyte. And then that oligodendrocyte might also be insulating another neuron, another axon. So these oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system can extend their processes, and they can form the myelin sheath, the insulation of multiple neurons. Okay, so that's our intro. And next, we're going to actually start talking about the propagation of an action potential.